Which one?
The Oakwood Cemetery or Eastview?
Well, because I'm not from Hickory. I'm from Newton. And all of my relatives are buried over in Eastview. And I would rather have been buried in Eastview. And just like all of the people who have relatives who are buried in Oakwood, they're going to want to be buried in Oakwood. And there are a lot of family plots over that way. So it really depends on where you're from. But if you were really talking about where I would really prefer to be buried, it's not even in this county.
Really?
Mm-hmm. My father's uncle and aunt, and I will tell you that my father was really old when I was born, and my dad was born in 1903.
Oh, wow.
And this is his uncle and his aunt. When I went to their funeral. They live in a little town called Swannanoa, just outside of Asheville.
Yeah, I know exactly where that's at.
And there is a
It's pretty up
family plot up there for the Huey family. And my great uncle and his wife were related by marriage to the Huey family. And they had a son who died in an accident when he was 12. And he was buried in that cemetery, and they are buried there with him. And you have to go, it's on private property, and you have to drive down a little dirt road, and you can only go so far, and then you have to take the coffin out of the hearse, and you have to carry it up a hill and go through the gate in a stone wall, and you go in, and it's full of woods, and the mountains are all around. It's on the side of a mountain.
That's so cool.
And it's so peaceful, and it's so calm, and it's so quiet, and it's so lovely, that if I could choose someplace, I would be buried there. And if you look at the difference between the Newton Cemetery and Oakwood, Oakwood is by far more beautiful, more serene, and more peaceful. By
It
far.
is. You have any more questions?
We love you, son. But if you ever put a hand on her, you know we'll have to kill you.
Oh.
And I'd already told him the same day. I love you, and I want to be married to you. But you know that if you ever hit me, you had better be prepared, because when you go to
Run.
sleep, I'm going to tie you up, and I'm going to beat the daylights out of you. And the man has never hit anything. I'm the one who hit him.
Oh my God.
With a rock. And so the man he is the most nonviolent human being you're ever going to meet. And so
Really?
he's just kind of it was a funny little thing, but we've been married for a long time.
That
And
is-
he tolerates me.
That is
And
such a blessing.
he comes from a really quiet, reserved family, and I come from one where we'll talk your ear off, and we're real opinionated, and we will tell each other exactly what we think right to your face, and not be mad at you. And whenever my brother and his first wife, we got married the same year. We got married, my husband and I, in June, and my brother and his wife got married in September. And we went to Six Flags over Georgia for the day, all four of us. And my brother's first wife was walking along, and she said, "Al, you've been around them for a long time. Can you tell when they're mad?" He said, "They're never mad." He said, "They just speak their mind." And he said, "And they get all into arguing, but nobody's mad." And he said, "Let me tell you what, you do something to one of them, and they're all going to get
All
you."
of them.
Yes. But I never hit him. I only hit him one time. But
With the rock.
Yeah, but it worked. It was like a cave woman,
She's so funny.
I'm crazy.
You're so funny.
Now,
But we're going to go ahead and start the interview. So if you can go ahead and state your name,
okay.
and your job title and your affiliation with the Oakwood Cemetery.
With my affiliation
Your
with the
affiliation.
cemetery. Okay, I'll be glad to. Are you ready?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. My name is Peggy Maness, and I am the genealogy assistant here at Patrick Beaver Library. And one of the things that I do is I tell people about famous people who've lived here, about interesting people who've lived here, about interesting places that are part of the community. And part of the interesting places are cemeteries. And one of them is Oakwood. And Oakwood is famous because it has on site the burial site of some of the most prominent citizens Hickory has ever produced.
Really?
And all of the old, well-to-do, early Hickory aristocracy is buried in Oakwood Cemetery, including 82 Confederate soldiers.
Wow.
There's also a really interesting, those 82 Confederates were joined by one Union captain.
And he's buried there.
He's buried there because he moved to North Carolina at the end of the Civil War and became very prominent. He lived for a time in Lenoir, and he moved here. His last name is Silly, and he
Heard about him.
yes, he moved here to Hickory, and he is buried over in Oakwood Cemetery. And he married a Southern girl and was quite accepted in this community. And it's an interesting thing that one of the people who is touted as being one of the 82 Confederate veterans was a colonel.
Ooh.
Yes, but he was a colonel kind of like the one with Kentucky Fried Chicken,
Mm-hmm.
because he was really not a real colonel. He just liked to give the impression that he was
a colonel.
And he was originally from New Orleans, and he was so young when the Civil War took place that he was not eligible to fight at all. But at that time, it was considered to be good for business to have been a former veteran. And so he claimed that, and they actually buried him over there, calling him Colonel Thornton. But Colonel Thornton was not a colonel, and he was not a veteran. He was a fun person, though.
Oh my gosh, that's funny.
So Oakwood is full of interesting people who did lots of things for Hickory. But the topic that you're asking me to talk about really is about it being sacred.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. And I'd like to address the sacredness of cemeteries first, because I teach a genealogy class, and I talk to them about how important genealogy can be when you look in cemeteries, because
Right.
that's where you find lots of family information. And if you take a look at a cemetery, you think about the purpose of the cemetery, and the purpose is to find a resting place for your loved ones.
Am I interrupting something?
They're taping me for a program at Lenoir-Rhyne.
Very good.
Sorry.
No problem.
And the cemetery has all of these wonderful monuments. It has all of these things. But the important thing is it offers you a place to go and reconnect with someone who's passed away.
Mm-hmm.
If I go on different holidays and different birthdays to the cemetery to visit my parents' graves, I go to visit my grandparents' graves. And I had the pleasure once of going to visit my 5 times great-grandfather's grave right about the time that it was the 200th year that he had been buried,
Really?
and saw his monument that has his name, all 11 of his children, and his wife's name, because he was a captain in the Revolutionary War. And
they're all buried
didn't really
together?
didn't really fight. But no, they're not all buried there together. Just he and his wife were buried there. But the DAR put up a monument to him to commemorate it. And I can tell you that when I stood there and looked at his grave, I felt a connection to him. And that's what a cemetery can do. You can go back and you can see where your ancestors were buried, and you can feel a connection. And it's like, it's a step into eternity, because he may not be there. I may never have seen him. I may never have met him. And what's left of him after over 200 years is probably not a lot. But that's sacred ground to me because that's where he was. And well, that's where what's left of him is. There may be a bone or two down there, who knows?
Right.
But he's there. I know he's there. And that man had a part in giving me life. Well, all cemeteries are like that. But Oakwood, and let me tell you, in order to understand Oakwood, one of the interesting things is to think about what is there at Oakwood. And I know you two have visited Oakwood.
We have.
Well, I bet you haven't visited the old Robinson Cemetery, but I bet you've passed it. The old Robinson Cemetery was the original cemetery in Hickory. And it was, there were people who were buried there about 1868 because Hickory was not really established as a town until after the Civil War. And it was after the Civil War that it really became a town when the Civil War veterans came back. And they were wanting to do something with their lives that was positive, and they wanted to build something, and that's when they came back. Well, at that time, a lot of the property here was owned by a man named John Robinson. And John Robinson and his wife had property over in Hickory. Have you passed by that log cabin that's downtown in Hickory? It's over, it's on, I can't remember the name of the street, but it's almost in downtown Hickory. There's a log house down
I
there.
didn't know that.
Well, if you go over there and you look at the log house, what you don't realize, first of all, that log house is not the Hickory Tavern. People think it is, but it's not. It was the Wilson cabin, and it was moved there from out
Wait,
off
the
of
Hickory
Startown
Tavern?
Road. Yes.
It's right there on 127?
Oh, there's no. The original building
Downtown.
in Hickory was Hickory Tavern.
Yeah.
That was what the town was called because there was a tavern here, and it was a place where people, when they were traveling, could stay. And there was a stagecoach stop there, and that's how Hickory built up around it. Well, people think that old log cabin is the Hickory Tavern, but it isn't. But if you get out and you look around, there are no tombstones there, but that's where the original Robinson Cemetery, the original cemetery in Hickory, was there. Now, it's illegal to move bodies from a cemetery unless you can get permission.
Right.
And this is one of the things that happened. That cemetery held both white people and black people who had been slaves. And that was an unusual thing, but they were both groups of people were buried there. And it was in, that little cemetery is in downtown Hickory, and at the time, now you won't believe this because it's grown up around there and changed a lot, but at one time the houses of the most prominent people in Hickory were all downtown, close to the train track. It was considered to be really cool to live near the train.
Really?
Yes, don't ask me why, but it was. And all of these prominent businessmen built homes down there, and they didn't like the cemetery being there because, think about it, back then in the 1860s, people didn't get embalmed a lot. And they would think about all those decomposing bodies sitting there. They were afraid they were going to get some kind of germ or something, and they petitioned the town to move the cemetery. And so about I think it was about 1889, they actually purchased the city for $600 the property where Oakwood Cemetery sits today. And you may not believe
for
it.
Oakwood?
For all of that property. That was a lot of money back then. But $600 doesn't mean much to us today. But
No.
it was a lot of money then. Well, let me tell you. And you think, well, that's downtown Hickory, and it's right in the middle of a lot of nice old houses. Well, guess what? It wasn't in downtown Hickory at that time. That was country. Maple Grove, which sits right over here, was a dairy farm at one time, and this was country. All of the town was just centered right around the railroad tracks, and so they were really happy to get it out of their nice neighborhood, move it over there, and they did it. Yes, and they bought It was, I think, something like 9 acres, and then a little over 9 acres
Yeah.
of property that they bought. And then some of the first people that were buried there were people from the Robinson Cemetery.
They didn't move the bodies, they just moved the tombstones there.
Oh, no,
They moved the bodies.
they moved everything.
Oh, because they had permission.
Because they got permission, except for the unmarked graves. Now, there were some white unmarked graves and some black unmarked graves. And over there, in that piece of property, near that house, there are still graves over there, and most people would not know it because they're not marked.
Mm.
And so you think about how peaceful, how sacred does that property feel compared to Oakwood? Not very. But what makes Oakwood different?
Right. What makes Oakwood Cemetery sacred?
And what makes it different? If you go over there, what you're going to find is when they started building that cemetery, the man who built it, the man who did the design for the cemeteries, his name was F.A. Grace. And if you take a look at that picture right there, that is the interior of the old Elliott Opera House in downtown Hickory.
Uh-huh.
And that's just an artist's rendition of it. But he painted all the murals, and he did a lot of painting all over Hickory. He was a well-known artist and came down from up north, and he took on as his project, he was hired to help plan the cemetery. And he developed all the little streets. And this is a copy of the layout of the cemetery. And you see, those little streets actually have names. And he designed it so that it would have beautiful trees. And there's some really old trees over there. As a matter of fact, I read a newspaper article where they cut down a 100-year-old tree. And that 100-year-old tree was cut down probably 30 years ago. So some of those trees are really old. And he designed different mounds, and he laid out the plots and did all of that work to make Oakwood beautiful. And there are actually some places in there where there's some small fences and different things that are beautiful in the cemetery. And what makes this different? It's set apart. If you walk into that cemetery, you don't hear a lot of traffic.
No.
It's quiet.
Yep.
You hear birds.
Yep.
You see flowers. You see trees. You see grass. You see ground cover. You see monuments. All kinds of monuments. And what happens, what you see there, it's peaceful. And over at the old Robinson Cemetery, it's right between two really busy city streets. There's somebody coming and going all the time. There's no quiet, there's no peace. And the lot's pretty, it's well maintained, but it doesn't have that serenity. And so people don't think about that being a cemetery. But when you go to Oakwood, it's set apart. And when you go through there, it's arranged so that a person can go in and find the grave of their relative.
Mm-hmm.
We have books here at the library that tell where people who died for years long ago, where they're buried, so that you can go and actually find that grave without a lot of trouble. And that means you can go, and a lot of times there are places to sit, and you can go and you can sit and you can think about that person, you can think about that person's life, and you can feel close to somebody who is no longer with us. The other thing is, I want you to think about the most beautiful place that you've ever been. A lot of times what you think about is a garden, or you think about the mountains, or you think about the beach, or you think about something that has nature attached to it. And in the cemetery, you see all kinds of flowers and trees and shrubs and ornamental things. And when we see nature, it makes us feel closer to God. It makes, no matter which person or which religion you are, it gives you some serenity and some thinking. And so it becomes a sacred place because of how it looks. It becomes a sacred place because of who is there. It's people that mean something to us. When we go to visit, it's somebody that you want to see. And it's quiet and you can think without being disturbed. And there are really rules about behavior in a cemetery that most people hold. And so if you come into the rotunda in the library, and everybody thinks about the library as being a quiet place, but if you go downstairs to the circulation desk in the bottom of the rotunda, and you see a mother coming out of the children's room with 2 or 3 little children in tow, they are not always quiet. But they are not being disrespectful. It's just this is a friendly, fun place to go. But a cemetery makes you more thoughtful and introspective, and you begin to think about eternity, you begin to think about life, and you begin to think about death, and you begin to think about continuity through time of all kinds of things. One of the things when I was telling you about my fifth times great-grandfather,
Right.
my aunt was with me, and it's her 4 times great-grandfather. And we were looking around, and just over from that nice monument, there were 2 tall, round-topped stones that had been made out of the tombstones had been made out of soft-like material, and they had been put back together because the rock had crumbled, and they put them back together. And my aunt went over, put her arm over the top of the one, and she said, "Look at these pitiful stones." And I came over to look, and I said, "Mabel, that's our other 5th-time great-grandfather on your grandmother's side." And that's the burial place of James Dyer Justice, who was my 5th times great-grandfather, and they're buried just a few feet apart, and there beside of him is his wife. And it was really an interesting experience because now he died much later because he was younger. He died much later than the other man did, but it was amazing because I had read a little history about him and about his activities. He was he ran a land company for a company in New Jersey, and the writings that he did and the surveying that he did for that company, the papers are housed at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and at the University of North Carolina in Asheville. But that's not why I was proud of being kin to him. I was proud of being kin to him because in the little history it said that when he had to go to court to talk about surveying, and he had to go and give witness and testimony about things, particularly if there was going to be a lawsuit with somebody, and he was called as part of defense or whatever, the judge said, "It's absolutely redundant to ask James Dyer Justice to swear that he's telling the truth because he's never done anything but." And that I was really proud of it. And I felt a connection to him more than the Revolutionary War soldier. And everybody has a family member that they love, that they cherish, who has been important in their lives that is buried in a cemetery. And so Oakwood, I think, is sacred ground because it's the repository for important lives. And I'm not just talking about the rich and the famous or the ones who were the leaders of the community, because I'm going to tell you that I love to go visit my father's grave because I feel close to him when I see him. And I love to go visit my little grandfather's grave. My mother's little daddy, he was little French Canadian. We're all short. That's where I get my stunning height. And he is buried up there, and he worked for a living all through his life. He never had a lot of money. He never did anything that made him famous. But I love him. and I continue to love him, and I love to go and visit with him and my grandmother who is there with him. And that's part of what makes that property sacred. You don't have to be rich and famous to be loved, and you don't have to be rich and famous to be missed. And Oakwood, we may talk about all of those people that are buried over there who were prominent citizens, but over there in Oakwood Cemetery, there is a baby. And the woman who gave birth to that baby, and that baby died when it was young, they didn't keep a record exactly of where that child was buried, and she couldn't find it. And she was in tears, wanting to go and sit beside her child's grave. And they buried the baby before the baby died at birth, and they buried it before she got out of the hospital. And so she finally found out where it was, because one of the men who for the city helped her find it, and they found the baby. But that was a comfort to her. And so anything that provides comfort to people is sacred. Anything that connects you to God is sacred. And so Oakwood is a sacred place. And if you look on the stones, one of the most interesting things about a cemetery is looking at the headstones, because a lot of times those headstones have messages about something about the person, not just name and date, but sometimes carved into the old stones in the old part of the cemetery, you may find a symbol that lets you know that that person was a Mason, or you may find a symbol that lets you know that person was a sailor, or that person was in the military, or you may find there's one little section over there that was reserved for babies and small young children, and you may go over there and see a lamb as a headstone. And if you think about when you were in high school and you read about Thomas Wolfe and Look Homeward Angel, there's a cemetery in Hendersonville, North Carolina, where that angel, that his father really was a person who made monuments, and he sculpted an angel, and it's in the cemetery in Hendersonville. And you can see some beautiful works of art, and you can see some wonderful things to help people remember. And all of those things tie you to the past and make you feel better when you see them.
So imagine if the cemetery, Oakwood Cemetery, was taken away. How would you feel that the city of Hickory would feel about that?
Oh, I think that people would be devastated, because that cemetery is full of people who have descendants today. And I know how I felt when I went to my mother's grave, and I had just put a beautiful arrangement in the urn on her grave, and I came back 2 days later and someone had stolen it. And I know how I felt when they just took the flowers. Now, if they took her grave, I would be incensed. I would be devastated. I would have a multitude of horrible feelings. And I think that part of what is there is the history of this town. One of the most prominent men in Hickory's history was A.A. Shuford. And A.A. Shuford founded all kinds of things, a bank and businesses. And he was a person who gave back to the community. He was philanthropic. He was a good man, and he's buried over there. And I imagine that there's a lot of people in Hickory who would be really upset to think that they desecrated the grave. And one of the most awful things, if you read, that has happened before, where people have gone over and turned over cemetery stones, and they've done all kinds of things, and it's devastating to people.
But so I know for sure that a lot of the people that's buried at the Oakwood Cemetery, like Shuford, I think there's Rudisil, Limeberger. Do you know any affiliations as far as their association with the Lenoir-Rhyne, people that were buried there?
No, I don't, but I will tell you that cemetery has to be full of people who have an association with Lenoir-Rhyne, because Lenoir-Rhyne has been a big part of this community for a number of years. And people who are not necessarily rich and famous, but who taught, in the public schools who were trained at Lenoir-Rhyne College, who touched many, many lives, are buried in that cemetery. There are people who were businessmen who are buried in that cemetery. And I didn't go to Lenoir-Rhyne, and so I'm not sure about all of the people who led up to the founding. But this community is full of people who graduated from Lenoir-Rhyne. It's been an important part of the community for a long time, and I promise you that a lot of the people buried there are Lenoir-Rhyne graduates.
Mhm.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I have all these cousins who went to Lenoir-Rhyne. They were all Lutheran, and one of them is a Lutheran minister, and he started out over there, and he met his wife there, and all of his children attended Lenoir-Rhyne.
Oh, wow.
Yes, yes.
Wow. So I think this is my last question. You might have something. But as far as what the city, how does the city, in your words, how does the city view Oakwood Cemetery today?
Oh, I'm sure that they view it the same way that I do, that it's an important part of the community. It's the repository for our sacred dead.
Mm.
And if you think about it, the city cares enough. It's a municipal cemetery. That cemetery is well kept.
The landscape.
It's beautiful. They have to spend the money to do that. It comes, they don't, the sale of plots can't support the number of plots that they would have to sell every year in order to support that cemetery is probably not significant compared to what it costs to just maintain it, and to maintain an office there, and to hire people who work there, and to do the things that they do. And it's an important service to the community to offer burial sites for citizens who pass away. And I think they value it a great deal, and they value the history in it.
Do you know some of the rituals that occurred at the Oakwood Cemetery?
Beg pardon?
Some of the rituals that occurred at the Oakwood Cemetery?
Rituals?
Like, did they have burial services there? Did people go there to actually spend a lot of time in the actual cemetery?
Well, one of the things that they do is a lot of times, and it depends on the customs of the family, but most of the time people have graveside services after the actual funeral in the church and the receiving someplace else, either the funeral home or the church or at their home. They go with the body to the funeral, to the cemetery, and there is a graveside service that happens there, and it depends on the church. I'm Catholic, and I can tell you that there is a really serious, important part of the service when the body is committed to the ground that the priest performs with the family present. And that's important. And two, there are times that I know, for example, the JROTC program at Hickory High School used to go over on Veterans Day, and they would, because there are veterans of many wars who are buried in that cemetery. World War I, World War II, the Korean conflict, and I imagine the more recent ones in the Far East, in the East. But they go over on Veterans Day, and there's a ceremony that's held over there, and they put out American flags on the graves of the veterans that they know about.
Wow.
And I think that's an important thing. And then the thing is that cemeteries are not only have the kinds of things that the one in Newton, I know, has a sunrise service. It has a big open space in the middle of it, and they have a sunrise service there, or used to, and on Easter. But one of the things that I think is more important is that's the place that every person who has someone that they love who is buried there can go and commune with that person. And it's a place that you're welcome to go. It's a place where you can feel close again to that person. And that's the way I feel when I visit my parents' grave. I tell them all the latest, and they may not actually hear with ears, but I feel like
You
they
feel
do.
like they
I
do.
feel like they hear me. And may not be true, but you know, it gives me comfort and peace. And that's what really we look for when we go to visit those cemeteries, comfort and peace.
Last question. What do you see with the future of Oakwood Cemetery?
Well, it's been around for a long time. And there's a limited amount of space there,
Mm-hmm.
and the time will come when Oakwood will be full. That happened at the cemetery where my parents are buried.
Really?
In Newton. It's a small cemetery. It's this municipal cemetery for the city of Newton called Eastview. And there are no more plots there. I can't be buried where my parents are buried. But Newton just opened a new graveyard down the road. And probably that's where I'll go, because I don't want to be buried over there next to the racetrack.
So you would have wanted to be buried with your parents, or would you rather been buried at the Oakwood Cemetery?
At which